On the morning of the 11th of July, 1804, on a wooded ledge above the Hudson River at Weehawken, New Jersey, the sitting Vice President of the United States leveled a pistol and shot the man who invented American money, the man who had taken $79 million of debt that nobody on earth would touch, and turned it into the credit of a nation. Alexander Hamilton died the following afternoon, somewhere around 49 years old. Even his birth year is disputed. The duel took seconds. The machine he built has now run for more than 2 centuries, and it is running underneath every dollar in your pocket right now. Because rewind just 14 years before that morning, and the United States was the worst credit risk in the Western world. That debt, roughly $79 million by Hamilton's own reckoning, though the exact total shifts depending on who was counting, hung over a government that could not pay a cent of it. Its paper currency had died of shame. Its soldiers had been paid in promises. Its bonds changed hands for pennies. European bankers ranked the new republic somewhere below bankrupt. This is the story of how one man took that wreckage and, in about 5 years, assembled the financial machinery of a modern state. A funded national debt, a national bank, a mint, a currency, a coast guard, and a revenue system tested literally under fire. It is the story of a dinner table where the location of a nation's capital was traded for the fate of its credit, of a constitutional argument that still decides court cases today, and of the strangest twist of all, that the machine worked perfectly, and building it created the political warfare that eventually killed its builder. Because this is not really a story about a founding father. It is a story about debt, and about the one man of his generation who understood that debt, properly engineered, is not a burden. It is infrastructure. Start with the wreckage, because you cannot understand the machine without it. The American Revolution was won on money that did not exist. Congress under the Articles of Confederation had no power to tax, none. It could ask the 13 states for money, and the states could ignore it, and mostly they did. Millions requisitioned, pennies on the dollar received. So Congress did the only thing left. It printed. The Continental dollar rolled off the presses in the hundreds of millions, and it bought less with every printing, until in 1780 Congress itself surrendered and officially revalued its own currency at 40 paper dollars to 1, and the market said worse. The phrase that survived says everything, not worth a Continental. An entire nation had watched its money evaporate in its hands. The debts remained, loans from France and Dutch bankers, IOUs pressed on farmers for confiscated grain and horses, certificates handed to soldiers instead of wages, paper that veterans, desperate for cash, sold to speculators for a fraction of its face value. In 1783, unpaid officers of the Continental Army came close to open mutiny at Newburgh, and only George Washington's personal intervention talked them down. The war had been won, and the victor could not pay its own army. Twice, Congress tried to fix the flaw with a small national import duty. Both times a single state vetoed it, first Rhode Island, then New York, because under the Articles, fiscal reform required unanimity, and unanimity never came. Hold that image, a government begging 13 legislatures for permission to exist. Watching all of this and taking notes was a man with no state, no family name, and no money of his own. Alexander Hamilton was born on the Caribbean island of Nevis. In 1755 or 1757, the records disagree, to unmarried parents, orphaned young, and put to work as a clerk in a trading house on St Croix, where as a teenager he was left to run the firm, cargoes, exchange rates, credit, the arithmetic of the Atlantic economy. In 1772, a hurricane flattened the island. Hamilton wrote a description of it so vivid that it was published, and local merchants were impressed enough to fund his education in New York. That is the whole origin. The architect of American finance was a shipping clerk sent to the mainland on other people's money. He never forgot what credit could do, because credit was the only thing that had ever done anything for him. The war made him. He fought, caught Washington's eye, and spent 4 years as his aide-de-camp, reading the Army's hunger and Congress's helplessness in every dispatch. And while other officers dreamed of glory, Hamilton wrote long letters about banks. In 1781, aged in his mid-20s, he wrote to Congress's finance chief a sentence that would define his life and scandalize his enemies. "A national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing." Everyone else saw debt as sin. Hamilton saw it as cement, a shared obligation that would bind creditors, states and citizens to the survival of the Union that owed them. After the war, he founded the Bank of New York, pushed relentlessly for a stronger constitution, and when the Philadelphia Convention produced one in 1787, he co-wrote its sales brochure. The Federalist Papers, 85 essays of which Hamilton, by common attribution, wrote about 51, most of them in a matter of months, at a pace that still astonishes historians. In September 1789, the new government under that constitution needed someone to run its empty treasury. Washington chose the 30-something immigrant clerk. 10 days after Hamilton was confirmed, the House of Representatives asked its new Secretary of the Treasury to prepare a plan for the public credit and gave him until January. He took 110 days. What came back was not a payment plan. It was a blueprint for a country. The report on public credit landed on Congress in January 1790, and its numbers were brutal. About $11.7 million owed abroad, around $40 million of domestic federal debt, once you counted years of unpaid interest, and roughly $25 million more owed by the individual states, most of it, too, the cost of the same shared war. Call it $79 million, give or take the accounting, at a moment when the federal government's annual revenue was barely a 20th of that. Nobody disputed the whole. The fight was over what to do with it, and Hamilton's answer inverted everything his countrymen believed about debt. Do not pay it off, he argued. Fund it. Watch the machine, because this is the founding trick of American finance. Take the whole chaotic mass of wartime paper, the loan certificates, the soldiers' IOUs, the state obligations, and exchange it for new federal bonds at full face value, with interest payments guaranteed by specific permanent taxes pledged in advance. The blended interest bill would come down, softened by the terms of the swap, and a sinking fund would stand ready to buy the debt back in the open market whenever its price sagged a floor under the nation's own paper. The debt itself, he wrote in the report, was the price of liberty, and honorably serviced, it would stop being a millstone and become an asset. A reliably paid government bond is something a merchant can bank on, borrow against, trade. Fund the debt properly, Hamilton argued, and America's greatest liability would transform into its first financial instrument, a currency of credit for a country that had none. Default, discount, or delay, and the United States would stay a beggar for a generation. Then came the first firestorm, and it smelled of injustice. Full face value, paid to whom? The veterans who had earned those certificates had long since sold them to speculators, often for a few cents on the dollar, and everyone knew it. There were reports of buyers racing into the back country to sweep up paper ahead of the news from New York. James Madison, Hamilton's own Federalist co-author, rose in the House to demand discrimination, split the payout between original holders and current ones. Hamilton's reply was ice-cold machinery. A security must be worth the same in every hand, or it is not a security. Start adjudicating the moral history of every certificate, and no one will ever trust American paper again. The House agreed and voted discrimination down by a wide margin. It was the machine's first commandment, and it has never been repealed. The paper is the paper, whoever holds it. But the second fight nearly strangled the country in its cradle. Assumption, the federal takeover of $25 million of state debts, split the Union on a fault line of pure arithmetic. States still drowning in war debt, like Massachusetts and South Carolina, loved it. States that had already taxed their citizens to pay their debts down, above all Virginia, saw it as a swindle. Why should Virginians now be taxed again to pay Massachusetts's bills? Beneath the arithmetic lay something darker, a suspicion that Hamilton was deliberately concentrating money, creditors, and power around the federal government, which, to be fair, he was. That was the design. In April 1790, the House voted assumption down, and Hamilton's whole interlocking system began to stall. Credit, funding, revenue, all of it was one machine, and Congress had jammed the flywheel. What broke the deadlock was a dinner. In June 1790, Thomas Jefferson, newly returned from France as Secretary of State, encountered a Hamilton he barely recognized. Haggard, somber, by Jefferson's telling, pacing outside the president's door, talking of resignation and the disintegration of the Union. Jefferson invited Hamilton and Madison to dine. And at that table, according to the account Jefferson wrote down afterwards, and it must be said plainly that the details rest almost entirely on Jefferson's version, recorded by a man who later bitterly regretted the whole affair. The most famous bargain in American political history was struck. Madison would stop blocking assumption and let a few votes switch. In exchange, the permanent capital of the United States would leave the northern money centers and go south to a new city on the Potomac River, on Virginia's doorstep, after 10 years' residence in Philadelphia. A recalculation of the ledgers sweetened Virginia's account into the bargain. That summer, Congress passed the Residence Act, then the Funding Act. The federal district that became Washington, D.C., is, in the most literal sense, the price of the national debt. And the machine, switched on, worked faster than even Hamilton promised. New federal bonds went out. The government's interest payments arrived on schedule, and the paper of a nation that had been a byword for default began climbing toward face value. Within a few years, by common account, American securities were trading at and even above par in the markets of Europe. A bankrupt confederation had become, in market terms, a trustworthy borrower, arguably the fastest credit rehabilitation in financial history. Hamilton had funded the debt. Now he needed somewhere to put it to work, and his next proposal would split the government in two. In December 1790, he sent Congress his second great report and asked for something no American government had ever owned: a bank. The Bank of the United States would be capitalized at $10 million, a sum larger than all the existing banks in the country combined, with the government holding 1/5 and private investors the rest. And here is the loop that shows you how Hamilton's mind worked. Investors could pay for most of their bank shares not in gold, but in the new federal bonds. The debt he had just created became the capital of the bank he was now creating. The bank would hold the government's revenues, lend it money in emergencies, discipline the currency, and issue notes that traded as reliable money from Boston to Savannah. Wartime IOUs, spun through two transformations, had become a banking system. That is the whole Hamiltonian method in one machine. Nothing is wasted, everything is collateral. The bill passed Congress, and then Jefferson and Madison tried to kill it in Washington's study. The Constitution, they argued, nowhere grants the power to charter a bank. A government of enumerated powers cannot simply invent one. Sign this, and no principle limits what the federal government may do. Washington, genuinely shaken, sent their written opinions to Hamilton and asked for an answer. Hamilton returned roughly 15,000 words in about a week, and those words became the doctrine of implied powers. A government granted legitimate ends, collecting taxes, borrowing money, regulating trade, must possess the ordinary means of achieving them. And a national bank was exactly such a means, necessary and proper in the Constitution's own phrase. Washington signed in February 1791. Decades later, The Supreme Court wrote Hamilton's logic into constitutional law, where it remains the load-bearing wall of the modern federal government. When the bank's shares went on public sale that July, they sold out within the hour, and the scrip promptly doubled and redoubled in a speculative frenzy that gave the new machine its first taste of what markets do with good ideas. The machine was working, and this is where the story turns, because the price of the machine was not measured in dollars. Watch it from Jefferson's side of the table, and Hamilton's system looks entirely different. A permanent debt, deliberately maintained. A federal bank, hatched from a clause nobody could point to. A swelling Treasury Department that, by most counts, employed more people than the rest of the civilian government combined. And around all of it, a class of bondholders, bankers and speculators grown rich on public paper, men whose fortunes now depended on federal power, and who could be relied on to vote for more of it. To Jefferson, this was not finance. It was the British system of debt, patronage and corruption being rebuilt in Republican dress. He told Washington to his face in writing that Hamilton's treasury was a machine for the corruption of the legislature. So he and Madison did something the Constitution had not planned for. They organized. A newspaper was founded to attack the Treasury, its editor conveniently salaried as a translator in Jefferson's State Department. Like-minded men in Congress began voting as a bloc, calling themselves Republicans. Hamilton's men became Federalists. The framers had designed a government without parties and dreaded what they called faction. Hamilton's financial machine, in about 2 years, manufactured the American two-party system, the force that would define and end his career. Hold that thought, because it is loading the pistol at Weehawken. Hamilton, meanwhile, kept building. In 1791, he sent Congress a report on manufactures, sketching an industrial future decades ahead of its time, protected infant industries, a nation that made things instead of merely growing them. Congress shelved it, and the 20th century built it. But the report that touched every American hand was the next one, the Mint. The Coinage Act of April 1792 created the United States dollar as a real physical thing, defined by law as 371 1/4 grains of pure silver, with gold coins fixed alongside at 15 to 1, and radically for the age, divided it by tens, dimes, cents, a fully decimal currency, while Britain still counted 12 pence to a shilling. A national mint rose in Philadelphia, by common account the first building erected by the federal government under the new Constitution, and the law's penalty clause tells you how seriously they took the money. Any mint officer who debased the coinage faced death. The word dollar, the decimal point, the very arithmetic of American prices, that is Hamilton's report, hardened into law. But a mint and a bank and a funded debt all rest on the same foundation, and it is the least romantic thing in this story: revenue collection. Here is the machine beneath the machine. The government's income came overwhelmingly from customs duties, tariffs on imports, roughly 90% of federal revenue in those years, which meant the entire Hamiltonian edifice was funded at the waterfront, one ship's manifest at a time. So Hamilton built the waterfront a bureaucracy, collectors in every port, standardized paperwork, and because a tariff is only as real as its enforcement, a fleet. In 1790, at his request, Congress funded 10 armed cutters to chase smugglers along the coast. That little fleet, the Revenue Cutter Service, is the direct ancestor of the United States Coast Guard, which makes the Coast Guard, in its origins, the armed wing of a tax system. The interest on the debt was paid because the paperwork was boring and the cutters were fast. Infrastructure all the way down. Yet one tax in the system was different, and everyone knew it. To carry the assumed state debts, Hamilton had asked Congress in 1791 for the young government's first internal tax, an excise on distilled spirits. On the western frontier, that was not a luxury tax. Beyond the mountains, where cash barely existed and grain was too bulky to haul to market, farmers distilled their harvest into whiskey, and whiskey was savings, wages and currency itself. Worse, the law's structure bore hardest on the smallest stills. To a Westerner, this was the same arithmetic that had started the revolution, imposed by a distant government that could not even keep the Mississippi open for their trade. Collectors were threatened, tarred and feathered. In whole counties, the tax simply went unpaid. For 3 years, the resistance simmered. The whole system now rested on a tax that had never truly been enforced, and in the summer of 1794, the test arrived carrying rifles. That July, in western Pennsylvania, a federal marshal serving court summonses on delinquent distillers lit the fuse. Hundreds of armed militiamen besieged the fortified home of the regional tax inspector, General John Neville. Shots were exchanged. A leader of the attackers was killed, and the house was burned to the ground. Within weeks, thousands of angry Westerners, some 7,000 by common estimate, mustered outside Pittsburgh, and there was open talk of marching on the town, even of secession. Call it what the history books call it, the Whiskey Rebellion, and understand what it actually threatened. Not one tax in one valley, but the credibility of every promise Hamilton had stacked on top of that tax. If the United States could not collect its own revenue on its own soil, then the funded debt, the bank, the restored credit, all of it was paper again. Washington's response was overwhelming by design. Under the militia laws, he summoned roughly 13,000 troops from 4 states, a force larger than most armies he had commanded against the British, and rode out at its head, the only time a sitting American president has personally led an army in the field. Hamilton, who had pressed hardest for a show of force, rode with the expedition the whole way, a Treasury Secretary marching with the army sent to collect his tax. And the result was the best possible outcome disguised as an anticlimax. The rebellion evaporated. There was no battle. The army found no enemy, arrested a couple of dozen suspects, and marched home. 2 men were convicted of treason, and Washington pardoned both. Mercy at the end, but the demonstration was complete. The government of the United States would enforce its revenue laws, with an army if required, and its credit rested on exactly that certainty. The tax system had passed its trial by fire without firing a volley. It was the machine's final acceptance test, and its builder promptly left the factory. In January 1795, Hamilton resigned. The reason was almost comically fitting. The man who had made the United States solvent could not support his own family on a public salary and went home to practice law in New York. He never held office again, and his last decade curdled. In 1797, to refute a false accusation of corrupt speculation at the Treasury, he published a pamphlet confessing, in mortifying detail, to an adulterous affair with a woman whose husband had blackmailed him, clearing his official integrity at the cost of his political future. In the poisonous election of 1800, he detonated his own party, publishing an attack on President John Adams, a fellow Federalist. And when the vote produced a dead tie between Jefferson and Aaron Burr, it was Hamilton who lobbied Federalists to swallow hard and choose Jefferson, his oldest enemy, but in his eyes a man of actual convictions, where Burr had none. After 36 ballots in the House, Jefferson prevailed. Burr, now vice president and politically finished, did not forget who had finished him. The end came over a dinner party remark. In 1804, with Burr running for governor of New York, a newspaper printed a letter reporting that Hamilton had called Burr dangerous, and hinting at a still more despicable opinion expressed in private. Burr demanded an explanation. Hamilton, boxed in by the era's code of honor, would neither specify nor retract, and the challenge followed. On the morning of July the 11th, the 2 men were rowed across the Hudson to the dueling ground at Weehawken, where 3 years earlier, Hamilton's eldest son Philip had died in a duel of his own. Hamilton's written statement, composed beforehand and found among his papers, declared his intention to reserve and throw away my first fire. What actually happened on the ledge is disputed to this day. What is certain is that Burr's ball struck home, and Hamilton died the next afternoon, the 50-cent debts of his household proving that the founder of American finance had never bothered to get rich. The sitting vice president was indicted for murder, fled south, and finished his term presiding over the Senate, his public life as dead as his rival. Now for the verdict, and it was delivered of all people by his enemies. Jefferson took power in 1801, pledged against everything Hamiltonian, and sent his brilliant Treasury Secretary, Albert Gallatin, into the department to dig out the corruption. The story is told, it comes down to us from Gallatin's own recollection, that he reported back that there was nothing to find, the most perfect system ever formed, and that any tampering would only break it. Jefferson paid down debt, but he ran the machine as built, and then used it. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the United States for $15 million, financed substantially with bonds floated through European bankers. A country that 15 years earlier could not borrow the price of a warship bought half a continent on credit, Hamilton's credit. The bank died in 1811 when its recharter failed by a single vote. The War of 1812 promptly demonstrated why that was a mistake. And in 1816, a second Bank of the United States was chartered by the same Republicans who had buried the first. Customs revenue carried the federal government for most of a century. The dollar is still the dollar. When Daniel Webster looked back a generation later, he reached for scripture. He smote the rock of the national resources, and abundant streams of revenue gushed forth. The fates scattered like a parable. Burr lived 3 more decades, tried for treason in an unrelated adventure and acquitted, and died in obscurity. Jefferson served 2 terms atop the machine he had sworn to dismantle. And Elizabeth Hamilton, widowed at the ledge, spent the next 50 years as her husband's archivist and advocate, co-founding one of New York's first orphanages, hunting down his papers, securing his biography, and died in 1854. Aged 97, having defended the record long enough for history to read it. History eventually did. The immigrant clerk ended up on the $10 bill, and 2 centuries on became, improbably, the star of a Broadway musical. So what does Hamilton's machine actually teach? The machinery version, not the marble statue. That credit is a technology, and like any technology, it can be engineered. The United States did not become trustworthy and then borrow. It borrowed correctly and thereby became trustworthy. That the boring parts are the load-bearing parts, the customs house, the cutter fleet, the interest paid on schedule, because a promise is only infrastructure if it is kept mechanically, every quarter forever. And that the price of building financial machinery is political always. Every institution Hamilton created manufactured its own opposition, and the fight over what the machine is for, who it enriches, who commands it, has never stopped. It is the same fight behind every debt-ceiling standoff today, conducted on top of Hamilton's own architecture. A treasury market measured in the tens of trillions of dollars, the deepest in the world, where the full faith and credit of the United States, the exact asset Hamilton manufactured out of worthless paper in 1790, is still the closest thing on earth to a risk-free promise. But the machine's very first crisis came while its builder still lived, in the spring of 1792, when the founding speculator of the New York market borrowed against everything, bet on Hamilton's own bank shares, and took the young financial system to the edge of the abyss in a matter of weeks, forcing Hamilton to invent, on the spot, the crisis playbook central banks still follow. That man was William Dewar. That crash was America's first, and it is a story of its own which we tell next. Sources for this account include Hamilton's reports on public credit, on a national bank, on the establishment of a mint, and on manufactures as published in the papers of Alexander Hamilton, the Funding and Residence Acts of 1790, and the Coinage Act of 1792, the records and debates of the First Congress, Thomas Jefferson's memoranda recounting the dinner table bargain of 1790. Hamilton's 1791 opinion on the constitutionality of the bank and Washington's correspondence surrounding it. Treasury and militia records of the Whiskey Rebellion. Hamilton's published statement before the dual and contemporary accounts of his death, and the major documented biographies drawing on the Hamilton papers.